So just to introduce, on one level, Sandra needs no introduction because she's always here Tuesday night with us, learning with us, contributing, steering the conversation in our Parsha classes. I've been lucky enough to be learning with and from Sandra since my days back in KJ. And everyone who's been in our Parsha class this year has been lucky enough to learn with and from Sandra. And it means a lot to us that not only is she taking her time and offering it to us to learn together, but she reached out and said specifically how much she appreciates the learning community we've developed together over Zoom, through our show. And as part of the gratitude, Sandra's really giving back by sharing some of her Torah with us. So we really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And without further ado, Sandra, please take it away.
Thank you, Rabbi Stoller. I think you know how I feel about you. And I really thank you so much for inviting me to share this Tuesday night hour, our special dedicated time that we learn Torah together every Tuesday with the Stanton community so that we could learn tonight in preparation for Purim, which of course falls next week. It's not only an honor, it's especially poignant for me to speak at Stanton Street Shul right now via Zoom because the people here I've come to admire the people tremendously. We've learned the weekly Parsha together right here with you in this Zoom Beit Midrash from wonderful Rabbi Liat Stoller for the past 2.5, 3 years. So tonight, we'll take a slight side trip. I'll speak tonight a bit about who is Hatach in Megillat Esther, a question that might have elicited a yawn in some of you only yesterday. But trust me, the answer is sufficiently dramatic that by the end of this evening, you'll be waiting with a secret smile for this part of the Megillah to be read aloud on Purim night. My plan is to talk a bit, teach a bit, put the question of who is Hatach into a context, literally and midrashically, and then I'll read aloud a few exciting pages about Esther, Mordechai, and Hatach from my book, The Queen and the Spy Master. And then Rabbi Stoller will step in and lead a discussion interactively with everyone. So let's begin. We think we know the story of Purim. After all, every year we attend Shiurim about Megillat Esther. We hear Megillat Esther chanted aloud in synagogue, or we read it to ourselves. And if you're like me, you read it incessantly. So we think, what surprises can it hold for us? And the answer is so many. And after all, isn't that the nature of the Megillah? There are many aspects of the Purim tale that remain deliberately hidden, begging us to uncover and unravel them. In fact, while in the Talmud in general, there is no extensive midrashic treatment of a particular... Pardon me? Excuse me. Okay.
Sorry, Sandra, I just muted everyone again to make sure we're all muted, but you have to unmute then.
There you go.
We're ready.
Okay. Because I hear every little dit and dot. So it's, all right, here we go. We were talking about the hidden nature of the story of the Megillah. In fact, while in the Talmud in general, there's no extensive midrashic treatment of a particular sefer in Tanakh, the exception is the Talmud's discussion of Megillat Esther. Tractate Megillah's pages 10 through 17 are the longest single midrashic discussion about a single sefer in the Talmud Bavli. And the reason is that the story is endlessly fascinating, presenting mystery within mystery. Even the name Esther comes from the Hebrew root lastir, meaning to hide. So one could say that it's our obligation on Purim to uncover the hidden meanings in this thrilling story. And so in tonight's shiur, we will explore who Hatach is. His identity is actually a marvelous biblical surprise. And tonight you'll discover that this mostly unknown person plays a key role in the Purim story. Rabbi, before I continue, my screen is blank and I don't see you at all. I'm wondering if everyone can see me.
I can see you. I think we can all see
you.
Yeah, we can see you.
Yes.
Okay,
I can see you too.
Thank you, Rose.
And Sandra, imagine all of us in our underwear and then it won't be as scary.
It's much better to see you than it is to look at a blank screen. Okay, here we go. All right. There is an unexpected ringer, a person with a dual identity, planted in chapter 4 of Megillat Esther. The author of the Megillah employs a brilliant literary device at possibly the most crucial point in the Megillah, a book that is filled with important and dramatic moments. We all know the scene. It occurs in chapter 4, verse 8, at the point where Haman's extermination decree has already been written and sealed with the king's ring, pronouncing death to Persia's Jews in 11 months' time. A desperate Mordechai surprises Queen Esther, commanding her to go to the king and plead with him on behalf of our people. We must keep two facts in mind as we read this pivotal scene. First, that at Mordechai's instruction, Esther has kept her identity a secret since the day 6 years before that she entered the palace. And second, that Mordechai's present command that Esther go to the king and plead to her people takes Esther by surprise for another reason as well. Esther is dumbstruck by Mordechai's directive because Esther did not know of Haman's extermination decree until she heard about it from Mordechai. So here we are at chapter 4, verse 8 of the Megillah. A shocked and bewildered Queen Esther, hearing Mordechai's stunning command, demurs, telling Mordechai that everyone knows that it is against the law of the land to appear before the king uninvited. The penalty, she explains, is death. We've got a stalemate now between Mordechai and Esther. What I find fascinating is the mostly overlooked fact that this rapid fire and fraught, pivotal conversation between the story's two protagonists, in fact, does not occur between Mordechai and Esther at all. Mordechai and Esther at no time speak to each other face to face in chapter 4. This world-altering exchange in chapter 4 of the Megillah occurs through an intermediary. This single fact elevates the function and character of this particular intermediary or messenger above the unremarkable level of the Megillah's many other messengers. In fact, reflecting his importance, the messenger who shuttles between the queen and a distraught minister is actually named in the Megillah, which is singular in itself. This makes us sit up and take notice. Chapter 4's active and crucial messenger is named exactly 4 times in verses 5, 6, 9, and 10, after which he disappears from the Megillah without a trace. We know him as Hatach. But who is Hatach? Queen Esther inhabits a cloistered world where the highest placed woman in Persia is forbidden by strict societal norms and even stricter rules of protocol to hold private communications with a man outside of the royal circle and the palace. This is the reason that the role of any royal messenger would loom large in our story. But given Hatach's brief but critical role as trusted messenger between Queen Esther and Mordechai at this life and death juncture of the story, Hatach's identity is a serious and fascinating question. So it comes as no surprise that the rabbis of the Talmud and Midrash have avidly and creatively addressed it. There are close to 90 Talmudic and Aggadic or Midrashic references dealing with the simple but intriguing question of who is Hatach. Do not worry, I will not go through all 90 of them tonight. Another time, we'll have some fun. He pops up in the story seemingly from nowhere, and he abruptly disappears. Who is he, and why does it matter? To answer this question, most often quoted is Rashi, the great 11th century Torah sage who declares in his commentary to chapter 1, verse 21 of the book of Daniel, a bit of biblical TNT. Rashi says, Hatach ze Daniel. Hatach is Daniel. Rashi's amazing revelation is embellishing on the text's cryptic statement at the very beginning of Daniel's story, that after serving in the court of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, Daniel continued to advise kings for many years, including King Cyrus and Darius of Persia. We should all be reeling right now, going like this, what? Rashi's statement, as well as this verse in the book of Daniel, quite simply, are biblical dynamite. Wow. How did that get past us? Daniel is Hatach. We have a vision of Daniel, exiled at age 15 from Jerusalem in the year 597 BCE with the other noble Judean families to the court of conquering king Nebuchadnezzar. Years and trials pass, and Daniel thrives as a handsome, whip-smart, principled young man, an interpreter of dreams, a prophet, and an advisor in the courts of 2 Babylonian kings. But that is not all. Daniel goes on to serve 2 Persian kings as well, surviving not only scheming and envious Persian courtiers, but also famously the lion's den during the reign of King Darius, father of Ahasuerus/Xerxes, the reigning king of Megillat Esther. Now we have a vision of Daniel. This time he's growing old in service to 4 successive kings, Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar of Babylonia, and subsequently Cyrus and Darius of Persia. And pertinent to Megillat Esther, this allows Daniel to be alive and a very elder statesman in the court of King Ahasuerus/Xerxes, son and heir to Darius the Great. So Rashi places his hero of the Babylonian exile squarely into King Xerxes' court, perfectly positioned to be Esther's messenger, Hatach. Hatach ze Daniel, says Rashi. Hatach is Daniel. In light of all this, let's consider not just Rashi. Let's also look at the Talmud Bavli, written approximately 700 years before Rashi. In Talmud Megillah 15a, 2 great early Amoraim of the Bavli, Rav and Shmuel, had already said as much. Amar Rav, Hatach ze Daniel, said Rav, Hatach is Daniel. In that section of Talmud Megillah, Rav and Shmuel each presents an opinion as to why Daniel, advisor to kings, is also the Hatach of Megillat Esther. Each Talmudic sage parses Hatach's name for the solution. Considering that the word Hatach can mean cut off, lachtok is to slice, the Talmud says, Amar Rav, lama nikra shemo Hatach? Rav asks, why was Daniel called Hatach? Shechatechuhu migadulato. Because by that time, meaning by the time of Ahasuerus, Esther, and Mordechai, he had been cut down from his great position, the positions he had held under 4 prior kings. So according to Rav, Daniel is called Hatach at the time of Esther and Mordechai, because by the time of Ahasuerus, the very aged Daniel has been demoted, pushed aside by young, ambitious, political strivers in Xerxes' court. Daniel no longer has the ear of the king. The new royal broom has swept clean. But Shmuel reads Daniel's new name a bit differently, saying, he is called Hatach because kol divrei malchut nechtachin al piv. All the royal affairs were minutely analyzed, in our vernacular, sliced every which way. He analyzed and parsed minutely the affairs of state. According to Shmuel, then, while the aged Daniel was no longer chief advisor and decisor to Darius' son Xerxes, our king Ahasuerus, after all, this would be Daniel's 5th king that he would be serving, Daniel still was sharp enough and trusted enough to be the royal go-between. In the words of the Ibn Ezra, Kizaken haya. We know Daniel was very old. Harei chacham gadol haya. Adayin, he was still very wise. So the Megillah's humble description of Saris, which is what it calls Hatach, messenger or intermediary, belies Hatach's essential role. So by the time of Xerxes, Esther, and Mordechai, say the sages of the Talmud, Daniel was a very elder statesman, wise in the ways of politics and kingship, but with a reduced though trusted and important role. Consider it in modern day parlance. As Hatach in the palace of King Xerxes, Daniel still retained the highest security clearance, and his unofficial portfolio allowed him to come and go in and out of the palace and the corridors of power with a hand wave to the palace guards. He was the perfect messenger for Xerxes' queen. And untouched by the Talmud, but relevant to our story, is the following question. If Daniel was in fact Hatach, was he also, like Queen Esther, a crypto-Jew? Had Daniel been around so long that he had outlived his enemies and the memories of being baited as a court Jew 5 decades earlier? Did Esther and Mordechai entrust Hatach with their deepest fears and secrets in chapter 4's desperate flying messages precisely because he was Daniel and one of theirs? All this is possible. Now that we have solidly identified Hatach as Daniel, the Midrash picks up where the Talmud and Rashi leave off. Daniel, as we know, has, in his years at various royal courts, been a lightning rod for scheming rivals. Midrash Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, contemporaneous with the Talmud Bavli, picks up on that theme and addresses the further question of why Hatach is only mentioned in 4 verses of the Megillah. Why does he disappear abruptly from the text before the problem of Esther's going before the king unannounced to plead for her people is resolved? And here is why I love Midrash. Listen to what Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer suggests. In verse 6 of chapter 4, Esther sends Hatach out of the palace to inquire of Mordechai why he is covered in ashes and wailing in the public marketplace. Vayetze Hatach el Mordechai. Hatach went out to Mordechai, Vayagedlo, and he told him of Esther's concern. In verse 9, we read, Vayavo Hatach, and Hatach returned and told Esther the words of Mordechai. We can actually see, can't we, in our mind's eye, Hatach shuttling back and forth between queen and minister. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer reads in these parallel phrases of Hatach's going out and coming back, and in Hatach's abrupt disappearance from the Megillah, a macabre tale of murder. Says the Midrash, a terrified and sickened Esther, hearing that Mordechai is raving and filthy in the public square directly across from the main gate of the palace, sends for Hatach, the most trusted and loyal of her personal messengers, Ne'eman Beita, according to the Midrash, to find out what has befallen Mordechai. But unbeknownst to Esther, Hatach, and Mordechai, Hatach's goings and comings are also closely monitored by another. Can you guess which way Midrash Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer is going with this? The queen's messenger is followed by none other than Haman's informers, who keep close watch on the gates of the palace. Says Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, Vira'a Haman, Yotze Uba Lahatach, Veharago. Haman saw the goings and comings of Hatach, and so, realizing his importance, he has Hatach murdered. In fact, one of the commentaries in the Torah Chaim, which I have over here on my side, in case anyone wants me to read them out loud later, they're fascinating. It says that he had him trampled by the hooves of his own horse. So Haman tramples Hatach with the hooves of his own horse to keep him from shuttling back and forth between the queen and Mordechai. And so Hatach disappears from the Megillah. And so what do we have? We have Queen Esther left without a loyal and trusted messenger of Hatach's caliber, of course, which is trusted perhaps because of his Jewish background. So Esther is forced to improvise at this critical moment of the story. The Midrash is free to postulate about Hatach's disappearance from the Megillah and even to suggest his violent death, for the reason that the date and fact of Daniel's death are nowhere recorded in the Tanakh, which allows for all manner of creative storytelling. And of course, the Midrashists love the uncertainties and dangling threads of the Bible text. They pull on those threads and weave plausible, sometimes fantastic, always exciting stories about what could have happened to the Bible's characters. Before we leave this now solved mystery, I have another question for you that I've only hinted at. Have you ever wondered why Esther does not know of Haman's extermination decree? Something everyone else seems to know. And after all, knowing is a Leitwort, an often repeated leading word in this chapter of the Megillah. Consider that the chapter opens telling us, Mordechai yada, et kol asher na'asa. Mordechai knew all about Haman's killing decree. Then in verse 5, Esther does not know of the decree or why Mordechai is in sackcloth. She calls on Hatach to find out the answer, la da'at mazeh ve'al mazeh, in order to know what is going on. In verse 11, Esther tells Mordechai, Kol avdei hamelech ve'am medinot hamelech yodim, that everyone knows that no one may go before the king unannounced on penalty of death. And then finally in verse 14, Mordechai famously asks Esther, Mi yodea im la'et kazot higaat l'malchut. Who knows if for a moment such as this, you have attained the position of queen? So here is my other question. Why doesn't Esther know? Now I'll read to you. The women's palace compounds were as isolated as the moon. Runners carried no daily news bulletins to the exclusive and guarded doorways of the women's compounds. The only way news of a political nature penetrated the cloistered women's world was through the gossip of servants. News also traveled through the whispered messages of spies. The queen was the only woman whose quarters and privileges extended beyond the cloister and the purely domestic concerns. Ceremonially, the queen was in a class by herself. The queen had access to the king that no other woman and possibly no other person in the empire could duplicate. Because her walled apartments were located within the palace proper and separated only by a long marble breezeway from the king's private chambers, she was liable to overhear palace and national news and to encounter courtiers, diplomats, and servants. It was also possible that the king would bring her into his confidence on certain matters as the mood struck him, or if he thought she could be of assistance. But as regards Haman's decree, so recently written and dispatched, and concerning such an unsavory subject, the king had not spoken to Esther, nor had she yet heard of it through the palace or servant grapevine. There was really no need for her to have heard of it at all, especially as no one in the palace had any inkling of her people or her kindred. And so it was that while the news of the death decree was stunning Susa and spreading to the farthest corners of the Persian Empire, Esther, queen of Persia, was ignorant of it. 2 hours pass, and the queen's handmaid Azam returns to the queen, crestfallen. Tell me, Azam, was there a message for me from Mordechai? Mistress, Master Mordechai refused the fresh clothing and the bid to wash himself. He seemed quite angry and not madly raving at all. His eyes were clear and he deliberately ignored me, my man, and the clothing. I'm sorry I failed you, mistress. No, Azam, you have not failed completely. Mordechai's refusal is itself a message. Something extraordinary and dire is afoot. I must discover what it is. And in fact, I found another tiny tidbit in the Torah Chaim yesterday. It says, Levush sak yeshlo ta'am miyuchad. The clothing that Mordechai was wearing, which was basically sackcloth and covered in ashes, spoke its own language. The Midrash, Torah Chaim, says that it spoke its own language to those who would listen. And of course, Esther understood exactly what it meant. She said to her maid, "Something extraordinary and dire is afoot. I must discover what it is." Esther paused in thought and then said, "Azam, fetch Hatach. You can send word with Abbas, who guards and serves him. Tell Abbas it is urgent that I speak with Hatach immediately. Go now, please. Hatach will be my intermediary to Mordechai." Automatically, Esther analyzed what she knew and reasoned that by refusing to dress to comport himself as a proper minister and thereby be permitted to enter the king's gate, Mordechai's purpose must have been dual. First, to grab her attention, and second, to make a loud and unmistakable public statement. By remaining outside in the public square, Mordechai was deliberately avoiding communication with Esther. And this is because the queen, not an insubstantial force within her cloistered world, was powerless to exert any influence outside the palace compound, absent the king's imprimatur. So while Mordechai remained in the public square, Esther was unable to exert her will upon him. She presumed that he would send her a message when he saw fit. But Esther, the queen, was unwilling to wait in ignorance. She was desperate to know what was happening outside the palace. She was determined to open her own avenue of information, and she intended to do it using Hatach, the trusted and dignified palace regular who would act as her go-between. She would speak to Hatach, and he would be her mouthpiece with Mordechai. That Hatach was Daniel was not commonly known. Esther, for instance, did not yet know that Hatach had nearly a century of service and an encyclopedic knowledge of royal secrets under his belt, or that he was Mordechai's control. She would find this out later. For now, Esther knew only that Haggai, the head of the harem, entrusted Hatach with messages to her. And over the past 6 years, she had learned to trust Hatach too. She did not doubt that the mute giant Abbas, that was Haggai's guard, would relay to Hatach the emergency call from the queen. Hatach crossed the road, and with dignity and in a soft but commanding voice, he dispersed the small crowd surrounding the raving Mordechai. Then he crouched down so that he was eye to eye with Mordechai. They recognized each other, and both knew this was the moment of truth. "All right, Mordechai. Esther has sent me to hear from your own lips exactly why you are behaving thus. Tell me everything, and I will relay it to Esther. Do not omit any detail." So Mordechai retold to Daniel, as Hatach, everything in more detail than he had told anyone. Mordechai also gave Hatach a crumpled copy of the death decree to take back to Esther, having the dates for the massacre set out in bold script, and knowing that, even now, the Jews throughout the empire were reading the same words and were shocked, terrified, and hopeless. It was blood-chilling. Mordechai gripped Hatach's tunic front in his strong fist and practically spat the words into his face. "You must show this decree to Esther. Read it aloud to her so she hears it, and so that she knows it is official and real and deadly serious. You must command Esther in my name that she must use her position as queen of Persia to put a stop to this massacre now, before Haman's mercenaries march into Persia. Now, before the evil ones within Persia's own borders get a taste for the plunder they could have if they were to murder all the Jews of the empire. Tell Esther that Mordechai commands her to go to the king and plead with him, beg, if she must, for the lives of her people. Tell her all this, Hatach, and tell her I will not budge from this spot until I have her assurance that she will act. Hatach prized Mordechai's hand from his tunic and straightened up from his crouch. I will tell her, Mordechai. Leaning heavily on his walking staff, Hatach recrossed the boulevard from the public square to the fortress of Susa, making his way back through the king's gate and the palace corridors to the queen's apartment. He would walk this same path numerous times on this day and on the morrow as well, ferrying messages back and forth between Mordechai and Esther. Alternately exhausted and energized, Daniel as Hatach would not rest. It struck him that this was the reason he had survived for the past century and had served 4 kings. This was the reason he had maneuvered all of his agents and in the process broken their hearts. At stake was no less than the survival of his people in their land of exile. He would succeed because this was what he was: a Jew, a diplomat, a strategist, a survivor. Who knows if the reason I have survived this many years has been just for this one mission: saving my people from Haman's slaughtering machine. Hatach, speaking for Mordechai, would pose this precise question to Esther within the coming hours. So now we know. If Hatach's question is mi yodea, who knows if the reason I survived 4 kings and 100 years was to be Hatach and the messenger between Esther and Mordechai? And if Mordechai says to Esther, mi yodea, im la'it kazot higa'at lemachut, if for just this purpose is the reason you were elevated to queen 6 years ago, well, in the hindsight of 1,800 years, we know. We know who was Hatach, and we know why Esther, queen of all Persia, was in the dark about Haman's death decree. Thank you. That's my vignette shiur about something that probably didn't even think you didn't know yesterday. Thank you.
That was amazing, Sandra. Thank you so much. Just even before.
Oh, bavakasha. Who was that?
Can you show everyone your book? I want everyone to.
Phyllis.
Oh, Phyllis, fantastic.
Yeah, you're wonderful.
Okay, let's see.
It's a yofi.
Everyone, please make sure.
Phyllis. Awesome. So this is the Queen and the Spy Master. You know what I can do? I can do, Rabbi Stoller, after the shiur, I'll send you the a screenshot of the book jacket. And then everybody. So
I have a question. I have a question.
Readings. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I was just curious. Wasn't Vashti was the daughter, the orphan daughter of Belshazzar. How did that advisement? You said Daniel was also advising that king as well, right? At some. So
that's a fascinating interplay. Last year, I gave a talk to the Stanton Street Shul. See, these are my guys. These are my friends. I gave a talk. Whatever happened to Vashti, and I actually go through her origins and how she got here, and the midrashim that tell who she was and was she the daughter of the king or the granddaughter of the king, and her interaction. So al regel achad, it would be very hard, Rosie, to talk about her origins, but what's something, just so not to leave you dangling, is fascinating is that there are intersecting circles, and that's why Rashi, Rav, and Shmuel said Hatach Daniel. They were of the same epoch. They were of the same era. They intersected within years of each other, and the stories were too similar not to make you sit back and say, You had stories of an exile, stories of brilliant Jews, one a true Jew, one a crypto Jew. There are many discussions in the Talmud criticizing Esther for not being a Daniel. Daniel refused to eat the king's food in Nebuchadnezzar's palace, and he was a vegan, and he prays to God. There's no mention of God in Megillat Esther. no mention of what Esther eats at the king's table, and there are no prayers overtly in the Megillah. There are tremendous number of midrashim that insert Esther's prayer. The Greek version, the Septuagint version of Megillat Esther, has the text of her prayer. It's fabulous, it's gorgeous, but it's extra out of the Megillah. And then there's so you see that there's contrast between Megillat Esther and Daniel. There are similarities. If you consider them a kind of Venn diagram where there's circles, there's an intersecting part of the circle, and that's the piece that Hatach plays in the Megillah story. The two Venn diagrams of two circles and two worlds, and the rabbis talk about them endlessly and brilliantly and so fascinatingly. But the piece for our interest tonight is that tiny little intersecting slice of the circle that was Daniel, and why Rav, Shmuel, and Rashi say, see Daniel, you see where he was, you see how important he was and what he knew. He had 100 years of knowledge of the real politic of being a Jew in the administration of the exilic communities. Well, we're going to use him, and he is Hatach. And that's why there are 90 midrashim that talk about this. So I hope I helped you. It doesn't give you the exact answer where she is in the phylogenetic, listing of where she is, because that's not actually positive yet. But that's a good one, and that's another intersection in the Venn diagram, and I do deal with it in the book.
Sorry.
Question. Thank you.
You guys are gonna have to forgive me if I need to take a break to cough or catch my breath, but I can't help myself. Sandra presented too much amazing material, so I want to respond a little, and then.
Oh yeah, please.
You mentioned that Achashverosh was the son of a king.
Who's speaking? Could you tilt your?
My name is Sheldon Weeder. I'm listening. I'm
okay. I can't see you at all, so it's
I'm up here.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
I thought that he was some sort of a usurper who got to the throne through machinations and married Vashti, because she was the king's granddaughter or something like that.
Yeah,
but that he wasn't of noble birth.
So remember that the Midrashim and the Bavli and the Midrashim of the Talmud Bavli and the Midrashim that were contemporaneous with Bavli, they didn't care about, or perhaps didn't even know, of the of Herodotus and the actual historic placement of Xerxes in our story. So it really does you need to have a bicameral mind. You need to think about things in the way of the Talmud and Midrash, and you need to think about things in the way of what's historically accurate. And basically, what's historically accurate is that Achashverosh, and what's wonderful, if I interrupt myself, is that in the Torah Chaim, a compendium of Midrashim by Katzenellenbogen, just a giant of a rabbi who compiled this book, they even talk about that in the Midrashim, saying he was a great warrior. He wasn't a usurper, or probably wasn't. They don't want to contradict each other. He was a great warrior, and he was probably the dynastic scion, the heir to the crown. I talk about that extensively in my book, giving you a very good historic perspective of who exactly Xerxes Ahasuerus is and when. So it's a great question because it's very puzzling and troubling. But even the Midrashim, some of the enlightened, or let's put it this way, more worldly enlightened, know, or at least suspect, that this doesn't weigh properly, and so they deal with it. But I don't really have a problem dealing with conflicting stories. I sort of like the challenge, and but historically, Xerxes was most probably Ahasuerus. It fits in the time frame, and he wasn't a usurper. It's just it makes great story, make great Hollywood. It makes great Hollywood, but he probably wasn't a usurper. He was probably of royal blood. And in fact, I talk about this at the beginning of the book to put you in historical and literary context. His father sent him into Egypt to run military campaigns when he was still a young soldier. And so he made his bones by being sort of the governor general, military governor general of other parts of the Persian Empire. And just to put things in perspective for all of us, and I'm sure you all know this, but it's important for the one or two who don't. When the Megillah opens with that he was the king Mehodu Va'ad Kush, and basically what the Megillah wants you to know is that it's the entire world. Rabbi David Silber, who was my teacher at Drisha, says Hod is light and Kush signifies darkness. And so what the Megillah is telling us, everything is hidden or has another meaning in the Megillah. So it's not just Hodu, Me'ad Kush, the two countries, Afghanistan or Turkey or whatever. What it's showing you and what it wants the reader of the Megillah to know, that you're about to enter the world of a king who rules the world, from where the sun comes up, Hodu, Hod, to where the sun sets, Kush, or darkness. So once you understand that, we're looking at things in several layers of knowledge. We know the historical placement of Xerxes, but we also read the enormous and just so colorful and fabulous Midrashim and Talmudic understanding of it. And you know what? We interweave one with the other, which was the purpose of writing the book. So your question is a very good one. It troubles anybody who reads it, be like, oh, wait a minute, come on, that didn't happen then. And the answer is yes, but. And so the but in those lacuna, in those little opening spaces, entire worlds are written and imagined. Anyway, so that's why I have a 500-page book here. There you go. Anyone else? Rabbi Stoller.
Coach Thesis actually touched on that whole debate about the rabbinic perception of Persian dynasty. It's a very big question in later histories. But that was awesome. And I definitely want people to keep talking and asking questions. I want to respond a little because there's so much awesome material there. And first, I just want to say that you mentioned that we're doing this during our normal Tuesday night learning time. But this is so appropriate for a normal Tuesday night learning session, because this year our Tuesday night learning has really been dedicated to understanding Midrash, and specifically how and why rabbis use Midrash. And I think this was a beautiful example of the literary technique and the literary value Midrash often carries. It fills in those emotional elements, those personal elements, those backstories that something as terse as the Bible can't. But in that regard, I don't think I'm, God forbid, I don't think I'm disagreeing with you, but maybe like,
please do. That's what we have fun. In my prior life, I was a litigator, so I have a great time arguing. I love it.
So beautiful. So I think what you're bringing to color, which is so powerful, is the Midrash's emotional layer that it adds on top. I think what's fascinating are the ways it complements and the ways it's in tension with the pshat, with the simple understanding of what's going on. Because I think on a simple level, to some extent, the whole role of Hatach, at least in my explanation, you'll let me know if you disagree. We'll see what people think. But on a simple level, I think the role of Hatach is a little bit of reflection of the broader question, which you touched on in this moment, of is Esther a Persian or a Jew? There's a disconnect identity between Esther and Mordecai. And what I think, how I always read it, and this is probably informed by my teacher, Yoni Grossman, because I know I was in class with him.
Who's your teacher? Remind me of his name.
Professor Yoni Grossman.
Oh, yes.
From the Guts.
I have a book right behind me on Megillat Esther. He's got a.
So I was in his class that the book was based on. Oh, awesome. So he points out that if we understand that right now the Megillah is dealing with a break or a gap or a tension between Mordecai and Esther, then part of the role of Hatach is showing and emphasizing they're not talking to each other. There is a third Persian presence that is aware of everything they're saying. So it's so fascinating if that's part of what's being discussed, that Chazal look at that and say, oh, that third party Persian interloper, that's actually Daniel. He's actually a Jewish insider, and he's part of Mordecai's plan all along. So like, whereas the simple is trying to show us there's tension here. Mordecai and Esther are at odds. They're not even talking to each other. The rabbis come and say, no. There's a brilliant Jewish mastermind, Daniel, who's involved in helping Mordecai pull the strings. So I think that's like so striking how in some ways we see the tension. It's Mordecai and Daniel versus Esther. They're not all on the same team. But on the other way, the meaning or the feeling of having this Persian interloper running these treasonous messages back and forth Esther's trusting Hatach to literally convey the message, you're going to break the law and approach the king without being requested. You totally lose that level because now it's Daniel and it's not this interloper anymore. So I think it's just like a fascinating example of like what the rabbis are trying to do. They're trying to bring Daniel in to develop further, like you're saying, the intrigue, the political stakes, the relationship of Mordechai, and etc. But at the same time, you lose part of this scene of having this Persian dignitary running back and forth, giving these treasonous messages. So I think it's fascinating, and I've learned so much from this talk. So thank you.
And I have to tell you that
I have a question.
Just 1
Sandra?
second. Just let me respond, and then we'll get right back to you. Hold that thought. I don't not only don't I disagree with you, I totally agree with you, and in my book as well. But one thing that belies our discussion right now is his disappearance from the text. Because if he was just a Persian interloper, then where the heck is he? What they do, yank him at the last minute? Okay. And if he was Daniel, which is why the Midrashim go nuts, and they say, what happened to him? And of course, Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, which is such a, oh my God, out of this world Midrash. Okay. It actually gives the details of him being stomped on by the hooves of Haman's horse. And whether it happened or not, it's not the point. Rabbi Silber's always telling us that about Midrash, okay? Sure. It's that the rabbis who spent much more time than any of us studying this think that this could have happened this way for the reason that it was probably not a Persian interloper between them. It probably was Hatach hu Daniel. And for more reasons than just that it's a convenient little literary device, but because their worlds intersected. So I not only don't disagree with you, I totally agree with you. And it's in the book too, but that's what I think. I think the fact we can't go in the direction of a Persian interloper. We have to say Hatahu Daniel because he disappears from the text. What do we do with that? What? The king decided we're going to yank him. He's not going to be the messenger. The king didn't even know what was going on. So I think the fact that he disappears gives us pause. That's all. I just want to suggest that.
I think
right?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. And the last thing I'll say before shutting up and passing on to Margie for her question to everybody else.
No shutting up.
You're reminding me that I think that's part of the beauty too, that what the Megillah is telling us is after Esther has this come to God moment where she says, Rebech v'hatzalah, or where she says, Alech knos kol Yehudim, then Hatach falls out. Because even if practically she still needs a third party to reach Mordechai, it's as if they're talking to each other now.
Yes, exactly. Right. So he's not needed. I mean, one could say from a literary point of view, he did his job. I'm gone.
Pepper just peed on the floor, Shauna.
Exactly. Okay,
Sorry.
From the sublime to the ridiculous. Okay, so was it Margie who said she had a question?
It was Phyllis.
Phyllis.
You called my attention to, this is the second disappeared person in the Megillah. Vashti.
Yep.
She is suddenly gone. Was she simply banished? Was she put in exile? Was she murdered? Was she cut off? Verwaist? But it's a foreshadowing of what you've pulled out about her.
Well, that you're actually, I'm telling you, that's why the people at Stanton are my lucky audience, because last year we did Whatever Happened to Vashti. This year we're doing Who is Hatach? And basically what I teased out and pulled out is the two disappeared people, almost like a Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, but of course not. People, or and I'll just quickly give you a tiny piece because you did ask and things have to be answered. Okay, so the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi differ pretty greatly on their perceptions of Vashti. And that will determine what happened to her, Phyllis. So the Yerushalmi, if you look at the meaning, the Parsi, we call it Farsi, but it's actually Parsi. The Parsi meaning of the word Vashti means wise woman. And so there's a reason her name was wise. The Yerushalmi doesn't have a problem with her being wise and beautiful. Yifat Mar'eh. Of course, Esther outdoes her by being Yifat Mar'eh and Yifat Torah, and she's the foil for Vashti, but the Yerushalmi has her as wise and does not kill her off. The Bavli, 300 years later, and in exile, it's a whole different worldview. the Bavli already by then has her as evil, has her as having Israelite women dancing naked, which is why she is punished by being asked to dance naked before the king, and in fact has her growing dragon's tail, having leprosy and pimples. Okay, so understand that it's two different worldviews of her, and of course you could predict the Bavli says that Achashverosh had her killed. But I'll only just end this tiny inquiry by saying, leaving everybody with a question, which is this: has the Megillah had any problem describing people being dead, beheaded, hanged?
No.
And if the Megillah wanted to kill off Vashti, I submit that it would have done that. The fact is that we don't know what happened to her. It's wonderful from a Tanakh mystery standpoint that we don't know what happened to Daniel. We don't know that he died, just like we don't know that Rebecca died in the Chumash. It's hinted at by the fact that her maid dies. We don't know. So we don't know that Daniel died. We don't know what happened to Vashti. I suspect that she was banished and not killed, because I don't think the king would have had any problem killing her off and gleefully telling everybody about it. Or certainly the Divrei Hayamim would have had it. So the answer to your question is, you're right. That is, Hatach is a second disappeared character, and Stanton Street has now had both lectures, both little pieces talking about both of the disappeared people.
And your emphasis on the horse a couple of times is part of the vindication of the loss of Daniel, where Mordechai, turns it around and then they hang Haman. But the whole idea of the horse,
Brilliant, Rosie,
yeah.
because...
And in addition, let's say there's one more figure when we're all baffled by Pinchas, that later he is back in the Shmuel book, and that's hundreds of years later, also one of these turnaround things that is baffling, but you sort of have to accept it.
I had a teacher once. I remember asking you think it's an urgent question, but it's probably so stupid. I asked, well, I don't understand. What happened to, and fill in the blank? Could have been Rachel, it could have been Rebecca, it could have been someone. And I asked him, the Chumash doesn't tell us what happened to this. And the teacher was so patient with me, but it stayed with me.
Dina.
And and I wrote a whole book about that one. You can tell. These are the things that fascinate me. I give life to the people who are sort of sidelined, right? So anyway, so this teacher said to me something that just really stayed with me. And he said, the Chumash is a proscenium. There are people in the wings. We don't see all of them. I mean, he must have been just talking to me. I was so intent and urgent, and he knew he couldn't put me off. And I never forgot that. And he said, and when the character is needed, they come out of the wings. And when they're no longer needed, off they go. And that stays with me on a certain level all through the discussions, such as the ones we're all having here, because it doesn't matter how old we are, we still have those questions. Whatever happened to Vashti? Whatever happened to Rebecca? Whatever happened to Daniel? And we want to know. Mi Yodea. This is the light for it, because we're all motivated by Yodin. That's what I... That help you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I ask one more question, please?
Yes. With your question, please.
It's a little bit exactly off this topic, but I have in front of me here, it's a monograph by Rav Shlomo Brevda, who wrote this in 2008, and it's on the miracles of Purim. Are you familiar with that monograph?
I do. You know what I would like you to do? If you could take a screenshot, take a picture with your phone and send it to Rabbi Stoller, and he'll send it to me. That way I'll know, and I'll look at it.
In this monograph, Rabbi,
hold it up right now.
He goes through the Vilna Gaon's impression of and he talks about Esther being an elderly, observant Jewish lady who was she's really not a youngster. And I think it's fantastic to read it.
I would love to read it, and would you don't mind taking a screenshot and sending it to Rabbi Stoller?
I will. I'll have my wife do it.
Okay, good. And then we can have a more. But one thing I just want to leave you guys with is the notion that all these stories are never ending. We can say that this is over for now at the end of chapter 10 of the Megillah. We can say that the book of Daniel is over now, but it's not really. They keep going, obviously. And and some things are correctives for other things. And I'm sorry, the fellow that just spoke to me, his name, please?
Mr. Weeder.
Mr. Weeder?
Yeah.
Weeder. Mr. Weeder, what you said sparked something, which is, so whether or not Esther was or was not a Daniel-like, meaning religious, observant, ate kosher, kept to her menstrual cycle and all of this nonsense, not nonsense, but all of this stuff that people are asking, we have no answer to it. The book of Judith, which I gave a talk on over Hanukkah for my Jewish learning, so you could actually access the talk online. Judith was a corrective on many levels for Esther, because Judith was beautiful and she was observant of mitzvot and she saved the day. And there are many parallels, but she does Esther one better in the eyes of the authors. But you have to remember, Judith's book was not canonized, whereas Esther's book was canonized. And so we could go into another whole lecture about it, but there's a reason why the book of Esther is so beloved and so written about. I will say this, it probably tells the story of survival in the diaspora.
I completely agree. I think that's a great point to end on. The book of Esther is our first book in Tanakh and our only book in Tanakh written entirely in diaspora. So we just started to unlock some of the mysteries tonight, and over the next couple of weeks into Purim, we'll do some more. But thank you so much, Sandra, for showing us.
Yashikola.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rabbi, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you for our Tuesday cheer.
Thank you,
Thank you.
All right, of course.
Lovely.
This is so amazing, and we'll meet everyone back maybe tomorrow. Be on the lookout. I might have to cancel depending on how my COVID's going, but definitely next week. So
you should have a refuah shlema.
Thank you so much, and thank you for covering the bulk of the teaching tonight. You gave me a huge thank.
Very good. Thank you.
Sandra.
Rabbi. Thank you,
Thank you,
Sandra.
everyone.